Good afternoon. I am Michael Ignatieff, Rector and President of CEU. This is the 17th lecture in the series Rethinking Open Society. I kind of feel good about that. 17, many of you have been here for almost all of them, so you're to be congratulated for your fidelity and faithfulness. For those of you who don't know what we're doing, we're a university with an open society mission. A mission means nothing unless you're constantly examining what it means, what it could possibly mean, especially at a time like ours when open society is in question almost as never before since 1989. So that's what we're trying to do, to bring together thinkers and writers and people whom we respect to think with us, not only about open society, not only about the societies we're living in, but also about the function and mission of universities. What is our place? What is our role in this enterprise? So that's the series. We have tonight an extremely distinguished guest from Paris. I want to acknowledge with particular gratitude the support and assistance of the French Cultural Institute. Merci beaucoup pour votre participation. Monsieur le professeur a déjà fait une conférence chez vous. Pierre has already sung for his supper, once for the French Institute this afternoon, so he is being exploited without ceasing today, and we thank both the French Institute and Pierre for that. Let me also welcome certain ambassadors who are here. We thank the Diplomatic Corps for their presence and support at these events, and always welcome them with particular pleasure. Let me introduce Pierre Rosanvallon briefly. He is the professor of modern and contemporary history at the very pinnacle of French academic life, the Collège de France. It doesn't get any higher than that. You're at the top, in the high, remote atmosphere at the top of Parnassus at the Collège de France. And Pierre is one of the most distinguished members of a distinguished company. But there are things that you might not know about him, because I've known Pierre since the 1970s. And I first met him, I think this is significant, when he was working for the CFDT, one of the great unions, labor unions in France. First as a researcher and then the editor of its magazine. His roots are in, his original roots are in the union movement in France. And he's never lost a deep connection and a deep curiosity about the sociology, the politics of French working class life and the transformation of labor and the transformation of the experience of work in his own society. And that's endured throughout his career. If you look in the website, you will see that he has sponsored or helped to sponsor an extremely interesting web project on le travail in France, and with people speaking about the evolution of work in their society. So that's one thing that you might not know about him. The other thing you might not know about him is that he's had an extraordinarily ecumenical career in intellectual terms. It's hard even to know what to call him. Is Pierre Rosanvallon a sociologist? Because he's a sociologist of distinction and is the author of The Crisis of the Providential State, Crise de l'État-providence, one of the key books in European politics to think about what happened to the welfare state in the 1970s and 80s. He's also a historian of French democracy, extremely distinguished historian of the political evolution of France, but he's also a political theorist of democracy, a theorist of the crisis of representation in democracy, a theorist of the problems of inequality, the problems of equality, the restlessness that a society of equals, to quote one of the titles of his books, the restlessness and discontent that a society of equals creates. And his sense of democracy, I think, is very important for our Open Society project, because he constantly conveys the sense, and this something I've learned from him, of a sense of democracy being a perilous and uncertain experiment, not a solid institutional basis that you can take for granted and forget about, but a constant experiment that is open to disenchantment, that is indeterminate in its goals and destinations, that is constantly in peril, as it were, and constantly has to be reinvented. And that dynamic historical sense of democracy is, if I had to say one of the things I've taken from 30, 40 years of reading your work, that would be one of them. He's also given very powerful voice in a small polemical book, which I admire very much, called Le Parlement des Invisibles. He's given a very strong voice to the huge numbers of our own society who are rendered invisible by the society, who are not covered by the media, who are not discussed in the media, who have no voice in representative democracy, and have simply been consigned to silence. That concept that there are invisible people in an open society seems to me a very potent and important conclusion. I don't usually introduce people at this length. I hope the audience will allow me to do this simply because I've known this wonderful man for a very long time. He's going to lecture to us now on populism and democracy in Europe, history and theory. Pierre Rosanvallon.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael, for your generous presentation. And I'm very happy to be here today at the CEU to discuss a central question for all our European societies, and I would say also for all societies in the world today. The fact is that contemporary democratic disenchantment is everywhere in Europe. It clearly belongs to a history of unkept promises and betrayed ideals. Part of the problem has to do with the mistakes and shortcomings of politicians who are often out of touch with society, concerned primarily with their own careers, and in some instances even corrupt. Another issue is the parochialism of political parties. But these charges against the political world, from which populist parties have benefited considerably, do not explain everything. Disillusionment also arises from more structural causes, which characterize the contemporary phenomenon of democratic disaffection. I would like, in the first place, to emphasize one of these causes, the declining democratic performance of elections. To measure the nature and scope of this phenomenon properly, one must begin with recalling the classical theory of democratic election, which considers that it is expected to fulfill three essential democratic functions: representation, to select elected officials who would express the interests and problems of various social groups; legitimation, to give legitimacy to political institutions and leaders; and third element, monitoring elected officials. Upcoming elections put pressure on representatives to keep their promises and fulfill their platform, thus giving full validity to the idea of popular sovereignty. If they fulfilled this function, election could, in practice, be considered the democratic tool by excellence. But it quickly became apparent, once universal suffrage was established, that by no means were these three functions automatically fulfilled. Hence, the long story, beginning in the early 19th century, of projects seeking reform and institutional change by improving elections' democratic performance. They include, for example, the introduction of proportional representation, the formation of class-based parties, and more recently, for instance, the adoption of the principle of parity, male-female, as a way of making elected officials more representative. The creation also of committees and primaries to limit the influence of political machines and involve citizens in the selection of candidates. The adoption also of rules making it impossible to hold several positions simultaneously, or to impose term limits restricting the professionalization of politics. Also, procedures of recall and impeachment, the creation of independent commissions, and a lot of other elements. In addition to the classical difficulties to define efficient election, the fact is today that the present declining performance of elections also derives from three new relatively factors. In the first place, elections today are, for sociological and institutional reasons, less able to fulfill their representative function. For two reasons. From an institutional perspective, the increasing importance of executive power has altered the concept of representation. The project of representing society was conceived, of course, as consisting in the creation of parliamentary assemblies. They were imagined, as Mirabeau famously said in 1789, as a picture of society on a smaller scale. The concept of representation was, in this sense, inseparable from the expression of diversity. But today, the election of executive power has become the art of democratic life. This has been dubbed the presidentialization of democracy. But the problem is that a single individual, the chief executive, cannot, strictly speaking, be representative, as representation implies, by definition, the expression of plurality. From a sociological perspective also, the concept of representation was implicitly underwritten by the notion that society was comprised of orders, corporate bodies, classes, and populations with well-defined characteristics, which helped also to observe that there was something medieval about the idea of representation. The concept is still meaningful, but society can no longer be understood in these terms. We do indeed find ourselves in a new era of social identity, tied to the development of what I have called an individualism of singularity. The latter alters perception of society and the expectations of citizens. Its advent is a result of the growing complexity and heterogeneity of the social world, including changes in the nature of capitalism. But at an even deeper level, it arises from the fact that individuals are henceforth determined as much by their own life stories as by their social conditions. Some psychological studies have, for instance, emphasized the fact that individuals are now less concerned with what they own at a specific moment than what they feared they could lose or hope to gain. They increasingly see their lives in dynamic terms. The individual as history has first superimposed itself on the individuals as social condition, identified with a specific character of a group. The second element of the declining performance of elections is the declining capacity for legitimations. Elections have also, on the other hand, become less efficient at legitimating power, even if the primary and most basic characteristic of a democratic regime, of course, clearly remains the choice of the government by the governed. Yet, from the outset, this foundational assertion harbored a major ambiguity. The general will was, practically speaking, equated with the majority. That the majority of votes established power's legitimacy was universally accepted as the very essence of democratic life, for the substance of his claim was never considered. The problem is that a justifying principle and a selection technique became intertwined in democratic election. The problem is that these features are different in nature. One can understand why, as a selecting process, the concept of majority became compelling, given the self-evident arithmetic character on which it is based. But it is not the case if it is considered sociologically. For majority always refers to what remains a fraction of the people. The real justification of the power of the ballot box has, however, always been the idea of the general will, and first of the people, insofar as it represents society as whole. We have in this way pretended as if the majority were identical to the totality. The ambiguity allowed us to forget that electoral democracy is based on a fiction. Fiction in the juridical sense of the term, which can be defined as a way of thinking reality that renders it governable. This fiction has become increasingly problematic for one major reason. The term majority itself has lost the symbolic and practical value it once possessed. If it has remained perfectly defined in arithmetic terms, and consequently juridically, its sociological meaning is far less clear. The interest of the largest number of citizens can no longer be associated as directly with those of the majority as it was the case in the past. The people no longer conceives itself as a homogeneous mass. It presents itself as a series of personal stories, an accumulation of specific situations. This is why contemporary society increasingly makes sense of itself through the concept of minority. A minority is no longer just a little piece, which must yield to the bigger piece. It has become one of the social totality's multiple, refracted expression. Society now appears to us as a vast series of variations on the minority theme. People has become the plural form of minority. In purely quantitative terms, majorities in divided societies become very narrow, with victory hinging on a few percentage points. This reality is reinforced by vote counts, whether due to low turnout or blank ballots, and the bitterness of contemporary discussion on this topic of blank ballots, which end up making some electoral victories appear very fragile when compared to the total number of registered voters. The third element of this complication is a new political temporalities. The temporalities of political life have, for their part, been transformed in various ways. First, the concept of platform has, in an uncertain world, lost its coherence. Platforms, which used to be the centerpiece of election campaigns, revealing the major dividing lines between parties, were expected to be put into practice after the election. They established in this way a relatively strong connection between the moment when elections occurred and the moment when governments acted. A new relationship to the future and the increasingly personal nature of political conflict altered the ability of elections to project their democratic effect into the future. Elections have, by the same token, been reduced to little more than nominating processes. In this way, the gap has increased between electoral moments and governing moments. The different forms of elections declining democratic performance have, in this way, considerably exacerbated the original tensions inherent in democratic representation, which were tied to various modes of indeterminacy. Who is the people? What is sovereignty? Should democracy be direct or indirect? For these various reasons, elections have lost much of their democratic performance. Elections, of course, still have an essential role to play. They have an inescapable regulatory and necessary function and have the power of the final word. The virtue of this minimal definition, as Schumpeter put it, is that they bring conflict to an end in a peaceful way, since everyone can at least agree on the mathematical fact that 51 is greater than 49. Yes, it is not enough to satisfy expectations. This is why, at present, we find ourselves on a quest for post-electoral democracy. In what follows, I would like to suggest some of its characteristics, while emphasizing from the outset that it must be conceived as a complication of democracy's form and mechanisms. Freeze requires that one first consider the populist ideology, rhetoric, that now presents itself throughout Europe as a response to many democratic frustration, while attracting great audiences we know exist on every continent. Populism has to be understood as a project for regenerating democracies that are withered and lost their way. Contrary to the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, which sought a substantive break with democratic forms deemed bourgeois, such as parliamentarism or pluralism, populism says and wants to restore an original democracy. To assess this populist project and the danger it entails, I propose constructing it as an ideal type, that is, to consider it as a political form with its own consistency and coherence. This means abandoning elastic uses of the term, which refer vaguely to a political system considered demagogic and which have stigmatizing connotations that are at least ambiguous due to their frequently contemptuous implication with the people of populism, often being conflated with the problematic populace of antiquity. Populism has to be taken seriously. Populism, in the serious sense of the term, in which I understand it, refers to a specific conception of political representation, a specific conception of the exercise of sovereignty, and a specific conception of the reign of the general will. The ideal type of populism that I propose to construct is based on the characteristics of so-called regimes, mainly in Latin America, but also based on the analysis of classical books proposing a theory of populism. I could think mainly of Chantal Mouffe or Ernesto Laclau. And I also used in my work some characteristics of European movement. Populism bases itself on representation as a conception of incarnation. Incarnation as the best form of representation. The leader is supposed to be the embodiment of the people. He is the people as a man, a phrase, it is worth noting, that was invented in the early 19th century to apply to Napoleon. The specter of bad representation, characteristic of ordinary parliamentarism, can in this way be dismissed at the same time as power's legitimacy is strengthened. It was in Latin America that this conception was theorized as early as the mid-19th century. I am not a man, I am a people. This word, instantly repeated by the Colombia's leader in the 30s, Eliezer Gaitan, set the tone for later populism across the continent. The fact is, Gaitan had been a student of one of the best friends of Mussolini, and Gaitan was admired by Fidel Castro as well by Perón, and also Chavez. Recently, in the 21st century, during the 2012 presidential campaign in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, I just mentioned, also referred to Gaitan, and he was repeating permanently the word, "When I see you," he said. He would typically say, "When you see me, something tells me, Chavez, you are the people. I am embodied in you. We are millions of Chavezes. Chavez is no longer just me. Chavez is the entire people." In his first inaugural address as President of the Republic in 1999, he went so far as to tell to his audience, "I hardly exist. Get ready to govern." It's a direct government through incarnation, something special. There could be no clearer way for legitimating a presidential regime that clings to the illusion that it is democratic. Laclau insisted permanently on this dimension, and thinking in this direction, he was also, of course, inspired by Carl Schmitt. A very important point is that most of the left-wing populists, most of the theoreticians at least, are very often quoting Carl Schmitt as, I would say, the first master and teacher of populism. And Laclau even said that consequently, that populist democracy implied, I quote, a process of indefinite re-election. In Maduro in Bolivia, you perhaps read in the newspaper yesterday that Maduro considered the Bolivian constitution as presenting a default because this constitution was undemocratic, because democracy means the freedom of the electors. And as the constitution had the proposition to limit to 2 mandates, it was undemocratic because it was making the electors, for them, impossible to re-elect the leader. And so he's just said that now he's ready to ask to be re-elected for the 4th time. And so democracy means the freedom of electors. So a constitution is something that could be against, I will come again to this point, to the, against democracy. The second characteristic of populism is a conception of direct sovereignty. This conception of representation as incarnation is logically connected to a conception of direct sovereignty in the form of election by acclamation, just to quote Carl Schmitt, who championed in the 30s this term. The people were supposed to exercise power directly through the mediation of its double, a concept that, in its own way, drew on the political theology of the king's 2 bodies. And referenda are also, from this perspective, seen as an ultimate means of democratic expression. They are sanctified as the most indisputable form of popular sovereignty. And the same can be said of the idea of constituent assembly. Constituent assembly, direct democracy, direct sovereignty are here absolutely central. And while an implicit political culture of unanimity underpins this conception of representation of sovereignty, it is nonetheless majorities that at the same time are seen in the populist vision, simple majorities, as a way to express the general will. Populism is, on this point, very traditional, but this conception is tied, and here is a rub, to the claim of populist movement to bring together the real people when their opponents are accused of only representing minority groups and foreign, imperialistic, or oligarchical interests. A simple majority can, in this sense, express the entire people. Even as minorities, populist movement can make the same claim on the grounds that the real people has been blinded and fooled by a news media in the pocket of foreign interest. Populist movement reject, consequently, and this is a crucial point, other forms that express the general will, notably constitutional courts and independent authorities. This is a constant that admits no exceptions. Witness the current situation and the debate in Europe. Just think about Poland. With such a conception of representation and of sovereignty, there is also an implicit sociology. In the populist conception of the world, the people unity is experienced at a practical level as a community based on rejection and separation, consistent with substantive conception of national identity. Laclau, for instance, explains that the unity of the people starts from a process of reconstruction of social divisions. He said in former class societies, division was very clear. In modern societies, divisions are multiple. It's unclear. And so you have to build unity with a new understanding of divisions. A new understanding of division making clear the unity of the people. And what makes clear the real unity of the people is opposing the people to what is not the people. Elites, oligarchies, imperialism, whatever may be the name. And what is very interesting in Laclau, he says, democracy means a vertical and horizontal movement. The horizontal movement is a reconstruction of the notion of social unity through this denomination of enemies, let's say, of different kinds. And in a vertical way, it is constructing identity through the leaders. And when you add the vertical movement and representation and the horizontal movement, the production of unity, you have really the core of democracy. Reorganizing social divisions is the key of discourses and practices also of populist movement. As a consequence, there is also an implicit philosophy and economy of justice that could be called national protectionism. I could say also that this vision of reconstructing social division in a simple way was something considered since the end of the 19th century. Maurice Barrès, one of the first theorists of such a negative conception of identity, remarked very tellingly at the end of the 19th century, the idea of the fatherland, he said, implies inequality, yet at the foreigner's expense. And through the divide resulting from an unequal relationship, we sought to bring the people closer together. There is, in this direction, a definition also, not only of unity, but of equality. equality is identity. Equality is not a relation between the people. Equality is a substantive quality. The philosophy of justice and the economic theory of justice, national protectionism, is based on the fact that a real identity has to be based through a process of separation. Unity is, socially speaking, something that is constructed with the definition of enemies, and that is economically constructed by the definition of protectionism. And such are the main intellectual basis of populist movement, that is, of populist rhetoric. The slide toward authoritarianism on the part of regime that arise from this movement is justified by the radicalization of the difference between the real people and an opposition that is reduced to being nothing more than oligarchies, American imperialism, or private interest. The general interest is always defined as proceeding of the very notion of identity of the people. And all what is outside this unity is special interest. So, in this direction, you had a very famous argument in the 19th century of Napoleon III. Napoleon III said to the opposition, well, what you call free press? What is a newspaper? A newspaper is money and talent. That means special interest. What is a democratic government? A democratic government has been elected by the citizen. Who elected the journalist? Nobody elected the journalist. And the journalists are not elected. They are special interest, and they pretend to play a role on the public sphere. So it's undemocratic. It's undemocratic because the public sphere has been organized by the vote. The public sphere has been organized by the people itself. And you pretend that special interest could become as important as elected persons. And the fact, and what was surprising, is that the Republicans, they were not able to answer this argument. They said to Napoleon III, you are an illiberal president. But say, I am not an illiberal, I am before everything a democratic president. That the capacity to criticize is illiberalism, but not to criticize is argument concerning the democracy. Populism is also, of course, when you start from an ideal type, you can also make the difference between movement and regime. You can make the difference between left-wing and right-wing populism, because the conception of antagonism is not the same, of course. In right-wing populism, the fear of foreigners, the xenophobic dimension will be central, when in left-wing populism, the critic of elite will be central. But in both cases, the central critic is liberal groups, and liberalism is the common element. Critic of liberalism is a common element between left-wing and right-wing liberalism. The fact that populist movements frequently shift to authoritarianism means that they have naturally been accused of being illiberal, as I said. But this charge is not enough. Worse, it is powerless if it is not accompanied by a genuinely democratic critic of populism. What remains to be accomplished on this front is considerable. Even if one takes the sole example of the referendum and its uses, we discussed it a few minutes ago, it is clear that at present there exists no critical analysis of his genuinely democratic procedure. One finds in populism an obviously democratic aura that must be systematically deconstructed. Elaborating a critique of his assumption is one of the decisive intellectual and political tasks of the moment. It's difficult sometimes to make comparison, but I would say for the generation of the 60s and of the 70s, intellectual critique of totalitarianism was at the core of redefining democracy. And I would say that today, critique and a better understanding of what populism is at the core of a redefinition, positive redefinition of a democracy. The first step for elaborating such a critique is now to show that if we want to summarize with one word populism, the populist rhetoric, we would say that is a definition of a polarized democracy. It is a vision and a process aiming at simplifying democracy. But on the contrary, I think that if democracy is in disarray today, it is not because it needs a simplification, it needs more polarization. It is because it means complication. We have to complicate and to multiply the modalities of democracy. And that is in this direction that we could overcome its incompleteness and move it forward. So we have to complicate democracy in order to fulfill it. Describing the advent of the democratic world that he witnessed firsthand, Tocqueville observed, the idea of government is becoming simpler. Number alone, he said, is right and lawful. All of politics, he said, is reduced to a question of arithmetic. Today, one must say exactly the opposite. Democratic progress means preserving democracy's complexity by multiplying the means through which the general will express itself, by broadening the modalities of representation, and by establishing pluralistic forms of sovereignty. We could start with explaining how to broaden representation. In 1789, the French Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen vigorously noted, I quote, ignorance, neglect, or contempt of the right of man are the sole cause of public calamities and of the corruption of government. This point is crucial. The quality of democracy depends precisely on the permanent presence in political life of the lived experience of citizens and the recollections of their rights. Representation means also, it's not only a procedure of delegation, it means making present in the public sphere social realities. Democracy does not only mean popular sovereignty, public deliberation, and the selection of representatives. It also means consideration for everyone, taking every condition explicitly into account. Consequently, this implies developing what I call narrative representation, alongside the more traditional idea of delegation representation, which incidentally works very poorly as the representative function of political parties have eroded as they have ingratiated themselves in the world of government. Yesterday, political parties were a kind of intermediary bodies between society and political institutions. Now political movements are organized on a top-down base. It's a leader claiming, asking for support. There are movements of support and no longer movement of social organization. So it is exactly the opposite. Indeed, not being represented means being invisible in the public sphere, not having one's problems considered and discussed. Representation has, in this instance, a cognitive and expressive dimension. The latter goes beyond representation as the imparting of form, which is traditionally opposed to procedural notions. There is indeed an active and polymorphous character in narrative representation, where representation as the imparting of form presupposes giving particular consideration to social conditions conceived very generally. The project of narrative democracy is, moreover, a way of building a society of individuals completely equal in dignity, recognition, and consideration, who form a common society. Greater visibility and legitimity, moreover, make society more governable and reformable. A society that falls short in representing itself oscillates between passivity and fear. It tends to be ruled by resentment, in which anger merges with powerlessness. Thus, it is unable to imagine in concrete terms a way of acting upon itself. Indeed, it must constantly caricature reality in the hope of making it malleable. In this way, societies end up being shaped by a phantasmagoric image of itself, designating scapegoats as a source of all evils. Democracy, however, can survive only if women and men recognize one another as they are in order to build a shared world. This means that it is necessary that some degree of mutual understanding exists between its members. For this reason, the price we paid for bad representation, for bad narrative representation, is as much social and moral as it is individual. We are terribly ignorant of one another, said the historian Jules Michelet when explaining the difficulty that individuals faced in forming a fraternal people with the onset of the new democratic republic in 1848. When reality is masked and when people's lives remain hidden, the imagination is governed by the effects of prejudice and fantasy. It also fuels mistrust and fear when people are unknown to one another and are unknown to political authorities, mechanism encouraging retreat into the private realm and ghettoization proliferate. We should never forget that trust has a cognitive dimension. To trust somebody means to have information on somebody. If you have no information on somebody, you can't trust him. So the knowledge on society, the knowledge of realities is something that is a fuel for trust. And the reason why a society can't develop itself if there are no mechanism of reciprocity and solidarity that are, at some degree, had to be based on trust. Never forget that a society has to work with formal institutions, but also with invisible institutions. There are three invisible institutions: trust, authority, and legitimacy. And the work to make real for invisible institutions is at the core of a democratic experiment, when a lot of people think that democracy is only about formal institution, I would say. And that makes also a difference between a populist vision of institution and, I say, a developed democratic vision of institution. The implementation of such a narrative democracy depends less on institutional mechanism than on the polymorphous development of academic and activist endeavor seeking to tell society's story. I gave as a title for one of my books, The Parliament of the Invisible. But of course, you can't organize a Parliament of the Invisible. The Parliament of the Invisible is a result of a lot of experiment, is a result of the literature at a given moment, of the movies, of investigation, of NGOs, of also of activists, of trade union. After all, at the beginning of the workers' movement, when the workers were not organized as trade union, were not organized very strongly as a party, of course, even not, they were producing information on their realities. In a very famous text on 1848, Marx famously said, producing a social movement starts with producing social investigation on the movement. So for one moment, be seriously Marxist. And another example is that is very, in my view, very positive, is that in the Great Depression of the 30s, at the moment of great difficulties in America, the federal government launched a project that he called the Federal Writers Project. And the project was to propose to more than 2,000 photographers, movie makers, novelists, journalists, to visit the depressed America and to show to all the country what was the reality of depressed America. And after some books have been very famous and some photographers have been very famous, like Dorota Lange, for instance, and many others also. And it changed a lot of things in American society. And one of the first things it changed is an acceptation for more taxes. Because the feeling that we were living something in common through the photographers, through the social investigation, through the movies, produced a new feeling of belonging to a same country. And the nation should be defined this way. The nation is not defined through a global identity. Nation is defined through a process of mutual knowledge. And this dimension means that there is also today a competition for two definitions of a nation. We have not to fear the word nation, but there are those two departing definitions. Apart from complicating social representation, we have also to complicate the forms of democratic legitimacy and the form of expression of the general will. The new forms refer to approaches to democratic generality that mitigate the achievement of its traditional and electoral and majoritarian expression by seeking to reconnect with an idea of the general will understood as society's unanimous expression. Two concepts can be used along this line to formulate from a different perspective the power of all, that is the foundation of the democratic ideal. Those two definitions, those two other definitions of the power of all are the power of nobody and the power of anybody. Democracy should be developed as along those three lines: the power of everybody, the power of nobody, and the power of anybody. The power of everybody is an approach through election, through the majority principle. But the power of nobody corresponds to another definition of the general will. The general will, it's a negative definition of the general will. And it's based on the principle of impartiality. An impartial institution is an institution that nobody, no interest group, no political party, no specific individual can claim to appropriate. The democratic power of everyone appears in this way as the power of nobody. Independent monitoring and regulatory authorities are based on this principle. Some were created by parliamentary assemblies to control and balance executive branches that were suspected of being partisan. Others were launched by the executive branches themselves in order to restore credibility or to hand over some of their powers in areas in which they did not feel technically competent. Their number is at present constantly on the rise in many countries due to the pressure of citizens who fear that authorities will abuse their power simply because they are majoritarian. The power of anyone refers to something different. The fact that the people is not only a population, it also consists of individuals, each of whom has rights that must be defended. In this sense, that it is historical when it understands itself dynamically as a community founded on shared values. And how is this collective dimension to be described, if not in terms of the principles upon which it is based? To give to the people as principle its proper political place means representing a people that can be also called legal in the term's constitutional sense. This justifies the normative superiority of the constitutional order. A constitution is two things: the memory of the general will, the history of the general will. And it is the reason why there is a superiority of the constitutional order, because it's a memory, an active memory. And the second dimension of the Constitution is that the Constitution is taking care of every citizen personally, because every citizen, not in all the countries, but in a growing number of countries, all the citizens can address, through complicated processes, but can address constitutional courts if they think their personal rights have not been seriously considered. And the power of all, in this case, is defined as the power of anyone. That is, the power of every individual who has the right to have its right protected and the means to make goods on them. The growing influence of these two types of institutions, corresponding to the power of nobody and to the power of everybody. This growing influence has generally been considered in classical liberal perspective, but we have also to consider them in a democratic perspective. As their role has grown, independent monitoring and regulatory authorities, as well as constitutional courts, have changed the terms in which democracy can be understood. But these changes have only been empirical. These institutions have yet to be conceptualized as a new political forms, as some specific new political forms which have a specific role to play in democracy. By the same token, they are just as likely to bring about an unprecedented enrichment of democracy as to bolster a timid form of liberalism or a government of experts or judges. And the question of the appropriateness of limiting majoritarian power implicitly belongs, in these instances, to the long-standing liberal view that denounces the risk of a tyranny of majority, which was leveled during the 19th century by those who feared to be overwhelmed by the advent of universal suffrage. Once again, it proves that we have in some way to transform the classical liberal thought about institution, to transform the classical liberal thought, to starting from this liberal thought, but to giving a new power to this idea. It's to thinking open society. And a constitution, for instance, in the 19th century was considered along this line sometimes. I quote Laboulaye. He was the administrator of the Collège de France in the mid-19th century. And he said, a constitution should be understood as a guarantee that the people creates, that is a guarantee that the people creates against those who do its business, so that they do not abuse the mandate with which they have been entrusted. Because the power of the people is only expressed in a conventional and limited way through majority voting, a richer definition is needed if one is to arrive at a more accurate understanding. This enrichment should go hand in hand with the possibility of broadening the concept of majority itself, in some cases, with the notion of super majorities. For instance, two-thirds majorities required in some constitutional decision. The third way to complicate democracy is to organize what could be called a permanent democracy. Electoral democracy is a kind of hemiplegic democracy. It's a democracy of nomination, but it's not a permanent democracy. Today, we could say that our regimes may call themselves democratic, but we are not governed democratically. This is the greatest split feeding contemporary disenchantment and disarray. Let me explain. Our regimes are considered democratic in the sense, evident, that their power arises from the ballot box after open competitions, and that we live instead based on the rule of law, which recognizes and protects individual freedom. These democracies are, of course, to a significant degree incomplete. The represented often feel abandoned by their legal representative, and the people, once elections are over, rarely feel sovereign. But this reality must not hide another fact, which has yet to be clearly identified in all its specificity, the misgovernment, le malgouvernement, that afflicts our society at its core. While political life may be organized around institutions that constitute a particular type of regime, it also consists in government action, that is, the daily management of public affairs, a body that makes decisions and issues orders. It is a locus for the exercise of power, which in constitutional terms is known as executive power. But as you probably know, executive power is everything now, but there are only 3 important books on the executive power. I will finish. And if we could say that democracy has to be complicated, it means also that we have to make a room for another democratic function. Classically, democracy has been defined by the voice of the people. But there is another definition of democracy. Democracy as the eye of the people. The distinction between the voice of the people and the eye of the people has been made by Bentham in a book of the early 19th century. And Bentham had this idea because he had considered all the images of the French Revolution. He knew very well. And on the images of the Revolution, the people was represented by 2 images. One image is an Hercule, there is a power. And the other image was an eye. And on many documents of the French Revolution, you have the eye. Today, to consider a permanent revolution, a permanent democracy, let's say, it's a democracy that makes a large room for the eye of the people. The eyes of people, meaning surveillance, control, means also organizing responsibility, transparency, and many other things. Just to finish with one word, I would say that the great debate today has to be a debate on the distinction between those two ways of considering democracy. Considering democracy with an idea of simplification, with considering very precisely all the consequences and the implication of such a vision of simplification, or considering the development of democracy with a process of complication. That is the key central democratic debate, I think, in the years to come. And for the new generation of political scientists, political theorists, political philosophers, historians, please do the job. Thank you.